time in Calgary?
I was there a couple months ago.
Oh yeah.
Just for work, like just we were moving spaces and stuff like that. So I was just there to, and some new staff joined us. So I just wanted to go see them,
Oh cool.
and yeah, it's awesome. I didn't realize how nice the downtown core is.
It's an underrated city.
Have you gone to Princess Island? Love that area.
Oh yeah, yeah. I stayed like at an Airbnb by the river with the bridge.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Princess Island is right there. Yeah, it was such a nice walk to work. Like it was, it was a pretty crappy weekend in terms of weather. Like it just snowed.
Like every other
All of a
Months
sudden.
ago, like you
Exactly.
were probably there.
Just that freak like winter that happened before the winter.
Oh, we were there in like September.
Yeah, I think it was one of those
Yeah.
months. Some terrible memory.
Well,
but
right now.
Yeah.
also the library is gorgeous.
I've never been in.
So nice. The
Really?
library and just general like I guess they had a lot of money to spend on statues and things. It's so nicely done. Yeah, everything looks new, but like not like new glass buildings that look ugly. Like it's got good character.
By the air. With the light at the top.
At least it's not the $4 million chandelier that we have under the Granville Bridge.
Yeah, true.
That's not culture. 4 point something, yeah.
$6.
Yeah. Is everybody here from the cohort? I wasn't here for day one, so I'm not sure what the situation is. I'm assuming people don't sit here, right? Just because of lecture? You? Not everybody? Who do I yell at? I think it's 14 of you. That I know. Yeah. So I guess I count 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 4 there. That's 12, 14. That's all of them. Yeah. Okay. In the back, did you want to move a little bit closer, or are you okay with the screen and my voice and all that? You're okay? Okay. Alrighty. Screen is good to go.
Yeah, it's nice, right?
Before we get started, I just wanted to ask a quick favor. I don't know if other instructors have done this, but because we have a Victoria cohort as well,
Yeah.
Does anybody help on Slack in terms of monitoring it for the instructors?
A few of us have it.
Oh, sweet. Okay, nice. So if you could just do that from, just have it open passively if you're not taking, while you're not taking notes and things like that. Really appreciate it. The more the merrier, because that way if anybody misses it, there's redundancy, right? And I'll do the same. Like you'll see me alt tabbing and stuff. Go. Got that. We've got this. We've got this. That. Okay. Good to go. 10 o'clock. Okay, I'll just do a quick test with Victoria just to make sure they can hear me and that they're all set up over there. All here. Wow. fastest response from a satellite cohort so far. I'm loving this. Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Cassidy, Benjamin, MX, Rosenthal, and Wilson, and everybody else that's there. That's pretty awesome. So they can hear me, and they're all there. We're good to go. How's everybody doing?
Good.
Especially after yesterday. How was yesterday, guys? How was yesterday? Yesterday's when, what's the technical term? Shit starts to get real. Did you guys, some of you, most of you probably started feeling a little bit more, oh, okay, like now I actually do understand why I have to be here till 9 p.m. sort of thing? Maybe the first 2 days weren't like that for some of you, but Wednesday is where it starts to, the reality of boot camp starts. It's more of what things will be like, setting the tone sort of thing. And so it's okay. I just wanted to say before we start, and I'll go through the agenda before we get into it, but I just want to quickly say before we get into it, it's okay that you haven't had everything fully finished from yesterday, if that's the case. That is pretty normal for most of boot camp. You'll probably be always feeling like you're 80% caught up, right? And if you're less than 80%, doesn't mean that you're like in big trouble or anything like that. I'm just using an arbitrary number, right? Just to give you an idea. By the way, I'm KV. Karam Virani is my full name. It's right there in the first line. I'm going to go a little bit into an intro because I missed the intros with you guys, which kind of sucks. I love the first day quirky facts and everything. Totally missed that for Vancouver. We won't obviously do intros, but at least I'll introduce myself, right? I'm told that when you start lecture, you're supposed to start with a joke. I don't know who told me that a long time ago. I've been doing it as much as I can. So we'll start off with a joke, and then we'll go into the agenda. How many software developers does it take to screw on a light bulb? None. It's a hardware problem. Always blame the hardware. Moral of the story. Okay, so the agenda is this. I'll spend about 5 minutes talking about me because I'm so important and shit. No, I'm kidding. Just to set expectations, talk about my style, things like that, quirky fact, whatnot. Then we're going to talk about the things that I feel are important. I know we've been talking about them already, so we won't spend all lecture on them. 5 minutes on actually doing something that we haven't probably done much, which is reading code. We've done it in terms of like indirectly and through osmosis, but actually talking deliberately about what does it mean to read code, not just write code. So we'll spend 5 minutes on that approximately. I never am on exactly on time. And then we'll kind of kick off the discussion about software and actually spend 30 minutes-ish, maybe 20 minutes if we can, on reviewing objects. This is not something I did for this lecture previously, but I started it in November of last year, so very recently. And it was received well. Like instead of just going straight into functions and callbacks, spending a little bit of time on objects review, especially given that yesterday was a tough day. So we'll do that, and I'll play it by ear in terms of how everything is going. But we'll actually use a challenge, right? Yesterday's lecture with Travis was a lot more about like small little exercises and kind of the features of objects, whereas today we'll do a bigger challenge and try to solve it with objects. And then we're going to really start talking about functions, which is where conversations about callbacks end up, which is not an easy thing to start off and talk about, but it's a huge kind of subject and one that we have to get comfortable with over time. Hopefully I'm not talking too fast, and hopefully Victoria's, I got 7, I think that's 8 beer mug emojis. I think that's a beer mug. What is that? Yeah, it's a beer mug.
Cheers.
Cheers, yeah, I guess so. If you're looking at the breakdown, it's approximately 50 minutes of the lecture, of the class, on the what's in Compass. I think that's fair. How's everybody feeling about that? Okay, cool. A little bit about me then. So I mentioned my name. It's really hard to say. So people generally here just resorted to calling me KV, and then it stuck. I started Lighthouse Labs 6 years ago. So I'm, I guess, one of the technical co-founders, so employee number 1. Moved from Toronto to Vancouver because I was done with the weather. I would never move to Calgary, even though I like it. Done with the traffic as well, and just had lived there a lot of my time and had worked at various different companies and startups and started a few of my own over there. I just felt like that chapter was closed and I wanted to move to Vancouver. My wife and I decided that's a good idea. And at the same time, I also realized that I wanted to start a school. I had already taught at a very similar program like ours. I'd like to think ours is better, which was the first in Canada out in Toronto. It's called BitMaker Labs. The folks in Toronto have heard of it if you haven't. And it's still going. And it was an amazing experience. I taught the first 2 cohorts there. I helped them build the program, helped them actually, start the curriculum and everything, and just loved the experience. But I was overwhelmed in terms of like doing that part-time while also having my own agency, my own software consultancy. And then eventually kind of stopped doing that, went back to consultancy. After a year of that, I was like, okay, like bored of doing services and just building small little apps for startups that don't go anywhere. Time to start up that school, but I also wanted to move to Vancouver, and that's how Lighthouse Labs started. I've been doing software development professionally for 15 years, but at a very young age, I was tinkering with computers, formatting C drive accidentally, things like that, MS-DOS, QBasic, those kind of like early day stuff. I remember the days of like VB6, for those of you who may know that term, or ICQ, IRC. I see some nods. So I got started with computers early on, very lucky, back where I grew up, which is in Pakistan. So I actually started teaching people how to use DOS and word processing as like a volunteer teacher at the age of 8 or 10. And that's when I really started, like, I guess ever since then I've been teaching or coaching or mentoring about computers in some way or form. So I guess it was in my destiny that I was going to not only be a software developer, but also be a teacher at some point in my life. And it happened sooner than I expected with the ability to start a boot camp versus having to join let's say a college part-time as an instructor and trying to change the system from within, which was my original plan, right? That's a lot of words. Hopefully gives you a general idea. I also have about 7 years professionally, I guess, in education, given that Lighthouse Labs has been around for 6, right? Weaknesses. I talk fast. I get excited. I've been trying to correct this for a while, but I guess still not fully there yet. So if you do catch me going too fast, I don't take it personally if you slow me down in whatever way you want, right? I also like to say what I'm not that great with. So I consider myself a senior developer, but that doesn't mean that I'm comfortable with all different software languages, tools, and things like that. I generally don't lecture during React Week. I still feel a little bit not as comfortable with it as I haven't built too many apps with it in production. So I let other instructors take the reign on that stuff. I'm really comfortable with Rails and Ruby. I spent a lot of my career on that stuff, so it's very easy for me. And of course, JavaScript's no problem. But yeah, front-end frameworks like React and Angular and these other ones, I've kind of haven't had that luxury quite yet. Why do you think it's important that I talk to you about my weaknesses, especially on the technical side? Yeah, partly, yeah. So you feel comfortable with your own weaknesses. So also I think often from what I've had conversations with students, they look at instructors as like, oh my God, I'm never going to be able to achieve that level of knowledge. And your definition of a senior developer is one that's perhaps a little misconstrued, that you need to know everything about every single language or every aspect of web development. I do believe that you should be a generalist for some time. Even, let's say, after you graduate, you end up taking a front-end React kind of role. I recommend that you try to do back-end development either on your own time or at work to kind of have the full stack experience. And then you can decide to specialize more a few years thereafter. We can talk more about that later. That's not what this lecture is about. Any questions so far? Yep, Kevin? What if you do all back-end and all front-end stuff looks scary? Yeah, it's a good question. It's not that I don't know React because it looks scary to me or I don't like front-end. I actually prefer front-end and back-end almost exactly the same, which is pretty rare to find, I think. For me, it's just like while I was doing web development, React and these front-end frameworks were quite nascent, right? While I was doing it like full-time. So I just didn't get that exposure. To answer your question more directly, what was your question again? Front-end seems scary. I encourage you, especially during boot camp, to focus on things, and we'll talk about this more when you get to the midterm and final projects, where it's easy to just like be like, I'm not good at front-end, why don't you take care of it? I say do the opposite, right? To actually take on the things that you're weaker at. That's why you're here, right? You're here to be surrounded by mentors and to work on the things that you're weaker at, not the things that you're strong with, right? We'll talk more about that when we get to those kind of opportunities. Is that a good enough answer for now? Yeah, sweet. Other questions before I talk about my style and then move on? So far, not too fast? Okay, first thing I'll say about my style is that I like long pauses. You might have already noticed that. I call them the awkward pause, and I like to champion those because one of my pet peeves is teachers that don't take awkward pauses after saying any questions, and then you don't have the time to think about a question or the courage to ask one or whatever it may be, and then you move on and it's too late, right? I try to have a discussion instead of a lecture. I agree with, was it Andy that said that they're misnamed? Yeah. Right? I agree with him. I don't know why we haven't bothered changing them, but here we are. But yeah, they're not as much lectures for me. They're more about showing you approach and also talking about approach from you. And we'll see that during this lecture as well. So as much discussion as possible, questions, answers, things like that. Of course, things are a little bit harder with folks in satellite, but I have Slack pulled up here, and I have some students monitoring that as well. And I've heard that Victoria, this cohort, is actually quite good at answering and asking questions, so I'm really excited to talk to them as well about this stuff. Now, when I ask a question, I am not looking to see who knows the answer. That's not the goal. The goal is to get you to think and not be on autopilot, right? Keep you engaged. Therefore, I reserve the right to, if I have somebody who seems to know a lot of answers, because everybody's here from different backgrounds, maybe even prior software developers. If somebody has a lot of answers and is generally the first one to raise their hand and also be correct all the time, I reserve the right to mute them and just say, actually, I'm going to mute you for temporarily, or if you're the only hand raised and nobody else is raising their hand, fine, then we'll talk, right? And hopefully nobody's going to get offended by that. Is that okay?
Maybe you could use the duck for that.
Give them the duck. Yeah, I know what you mean by the duck, but yeah, something like that. We could try something like that. And then the same is true for asking questions. So if I find that somebody's asking advanced questions and they're often in outside the scope of lecture, then I'll do my best, but I also have to keep our agenda in mind. I like to stick to the agenda. It's very rare that I'm not covering something that I said I would cover, right? And I have to keep on target for that. That said, if you have those kind of questions, there's the break in between, in the middle of the lecture, and then there's after lecture that we can chat, or of course there's mentors for that stuff, so obviously write that stuff down. As Travis and Andy have mentioned to you, please don't try to follow along code. Try to pair program with me by actually doing it all together on the screen, right? And then the code will be sent to you as part of notes. Have you already been getting notes for your lecture?
Yes.
Have they been good, useful? Yes. Probably better than you expected? Yeah. Right? We have awesome instructors, don't you think? I have pretty high expectations to fill, I feel. And generally I'll fall short, but that's okay. How's that for an intro? Is that okay?
Great.
Yeah? All right, let's move on. I don't know if that was 5 minutes or longer, but whatevs. So first thing is about reading code. Let's pull up some code. Here's some existing code that you may or may not have seen from, I think, yesterday or 2 days ago. It is a stretch assignment that you may have just opened up and was intimidated by and then closed, or took a stab at. If you haven't seen it, it doesn't matter. The whole point is you're looking at some code that you have barely seen. It may be yours from a long time ago, or it may be somebody else on your team that's written that code. How do you read it? So this is a question for all students, Victoria included. How do you read it? I want students to provide some suggestions or even just general kind of thoughts on that subject of reading code. In the back, what's your name? Leon, go ahead. Yep. So top to bottom, and one of the things you like to add as your own personal flair is like comment as you go, especially because cognitive load, right? You want to make sure you remember those things. So you're commenting as you're going, and you're also hopefully adding valuable comments, right? And that's a whole different beast, which is how do you make valuable comments versus just stuff that's obvious in the code, right? Victoria has comments. Speaking of comments, that's awesome. Slowly is a great answer. Left to right is also a great answer. This is English. Start at the top usually is also a great answer. Function at a time. Yeah, see, one of the things you'll find in this discussion is there's no one right answer here. I'm going to give you my opinions on this, but please take it with a grain of salt. Because as we said on day one, software development is opinionated. Remember that slide? Still there, right? That slide? Software development's opinionated. Is it not there in the day one slides anymore? Anyway, it is opinionated. Take my word for it. So yeah, all of those things are great. Any other additions before I jump on? Great. If you have access to the person that wrote it, maybe get them to explain it. That's not a bad strategy. Although you want to take your stab at reading it and not just seem like you're being lazy. You don't want to come across that way either, right? This is a big file, right? There's a lot of stuff happening here. Now, the purpose of this assignment was like fix some bugs, but that's not what we're going to do here. Let me ask a different question before we go further into this, while you're still thinking about the first answer. Why is this an important skill? You won't always be working on code that you've written or written recently. I'm obviously repeating for Victoria's sake as well as everybody else here. I totally agree.
Also, you're going to be writing it, so you should at least know how to read it.
You're writing it, so you should at least know how to read it. How often are you reading code versus writing code, right? I could argue that you're probably reading more than you're writing. It's, that like quintessential Hollywood, like here's a hacker, and then you just see the screen go like crazy. That is not what coding is, right? Often it's just like, and then you like put a few keystrokes down, and it's like, yeah, I think that's in the right direction, right? Like that's what it really is, right? So you're reading actually more than you're writing. What other situations come to mind in terms of reading code that actually, I'm going to throw another caveat on, that's on the screen, just like this, and you don't have control of the keyboard and mouse, and somebody's standing in front? Can you think of examples? So like this kind of a setting. Lecture is obviously one, but others. Yep, and what's your name? Calvin, sure. A work setting, yeah, go on. What do you mean by that? Yep, code reviews, actually. This is what I've experienced early on in my career. Was like we would do code reviews around like a couch. We had a TV on. We had like 5-6 developers sitting there, the one that's worked on a feature, presenting their feature, both showing the UI and what's changed in the app, but also showing the code, right? And people are asking questions. Well, what about this? Why did you do it this way? Where do you think it's weakest? Show us that part, or things like that, right? And you're having to analyze that code and asking them to go move around, right? Great skill, right? Another thing is software development is actually very, very conversational and very collaborative. And that's just one example. Another one I can think of, but before I do, other people, I saw some hands up. Liam, is that right?
Yeah.
Yep.
Like if you're watching a YouTube video.
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. You're trying to learn something. It's a different language, maybe, right? You're trying to learn, I don't know, something more hipster, like Elixir or something, or Go. All the cool languages these days. And you don't know the language, so the skill, your ability to read code that you're comfortable with, will make you better at reading code that's in a language that you're not comfortable with, right? Any others? Yeah. They're answering more. Oh, the last line. Reading code is important because you will forget that you've written it and need to relearn it. Absolutely. So many times I've looked at code that I wrote years ago and I'm like, what was I doing there? And again, that's an important skill, right? And also, having gone through that pain, you also start writing code and commenting in a much more proactive manner. Another example to my previous question was when you go to conferences and meetups, they're doing something very similar to what I described those code reviews to be, right? They're teaching a new concept or something. You're looking at code all the time. That's not on even on your own screen. Another example is pair programming, which you'll start to do next week. You'll be working together on problems, and somebody else will be writing, and you'll be kind of co-pilot, right? So that'll be another example of that. It's all over the place, right? Okay, so coming back to the very first question, tactics to be able to read code. Top to bottom. I agree with top to bottom, but top to bottom can be quite laborious and perhaps not the most efficient if you're doing literally top to bottom for the hundreds of lines, or in this case, 62 lines that are present here. So let's come up with something a little bit more. Yes, of course, you got to start at line 1. Where else are you going to start, right? But after line 1, do I have to go to line 2? Do I have to go to line 3? Layers is a great step in the right direction. What's your name? James said layers. Somebody in Wilson in Victoria said start with the variables. That's not a bad idea either. So you can kind of use your intuition here and be like, I can kind of understand what this is if they're named well, if they're not X, Y, Z, right? Another reason why you want to name things properly. Kevin? Not a bad strategy from Kevin. Look at all the functions and function names. So Kevin, would you suggest then I see a function here, and I see a function here, and I see a function here. It looks like a nested level, so lines 11 and 15 and so on. But then I also see functions outside that nesting, for example, here at line 43. So what am I doing here? Do I just go in function to function? You're suggesting the top level functions first. So that means calculate day and year, and maybe I could use my IDE to even collapse that and just take a look at the other function. Why are you doing that? I like this approach. This is the approach I'm going towards, but why? Start at high level and then circle in. Why? I'm still asking the same question. Why? That's how the code's going to be run. So depending on, this is a one-dimensional answer. So take it with a grain of salt. It all depends on what you're actually trying to do while you're reading the code. Why are you reading the code? What's your objective, right? If you're trying to debug the code or trace it, how is it actually running? Then you ought to be thinking and looking at the code in the same way that it's actually going to run, one could argue. It's not running top to bottom. JavaScript doesn't actually run line 1, then run line 2, then run line 3, does it? Why not? Why doesn't it run lines 2 and 3 in this case? Yep, because it's nested, said James. But more specifically, because an if statement is nested, but when an if statement is true, it does go into the inside. Nothing to do with hoisting in this example, but I like the tie-in from previous lecture. It's because this is a function, and the function isn't called yet. Right? This code has not executed yet. JavaScript will not be running this line of code, but because it would be operating unexpectedly if it did run this code, until it actually gets the function call. Do we agree? So the way I suggest we read code is to trace code most of the time, not all the time. And that means to run it as though we're JavaScript. And this is also good because we get to make sure that our mental model of how JavaScript or whatever language is running is correct, because we get to validate that. So we're also learning about how JavaScript is running as we get maybe corrected from time to time about how we thought it was going to run versus how it actually runs. Right? So in this example, how I would read this is, many of you already alluded to this. I would read this function. Now, I'm not JavaScript. I actually have more superpowers than JavaScript. I have human intuition. JavaScript doesn't look at that word and try to infer what this function is doing, but I can do that, right? Do we agree? So I can go, yeah, I think this function has something to do with dates and years and calculating a date in a year, and it takes in something called a date. I don't know what type that is. And then, I can decide if I want to go into that function, but ultimately, I might say, you know what, like, let's wait till it's called, and then I'll go into it. Boom, right? Whether I do that, I don't actually collapse functions in real life, but like, I just feel like scrolling is enough. And it's like, okay, there's one that is multiple. This is the next line that JavaScript would run. Okay, it seems like a simple function that like checks to see if the denominator is a multiple of the numerator, right? Or sorry, the numerator is a multiple of the denominator, right? Okay, cool. And then this is where I start to see the function actually being called. And now I can also see what's passed in and what's expected out of it. Number is expected out, string is passed in. Cool. Let's keep that in mind, and let's go down this list now, right? And we're going to keep going a little bit before I move on. But there's a question from Kevin here.
Question. What if there are no tests? There's just a file with the function.
What if there's no test is a good question, and I didn't bring up tests at all in this answer, right? I didn't say, oh, we leverage tests. In fact, most of the time, unfortunately, the real world is that there will not be tests, or there will be a lack of tests, not enough, right?
Yeah, so like.
So I'm not suggesting anything about tests here.
Like the function is never called in this file.
Say that again?
Like if the function isn't even called in this file.
Oh, if the function is not even called in this file.
Like all the tests are gone. All the tests are.
I see. So you're talking about the function's not even called. Well, then I'm just using one file as an example. You might have to switch between files as you're reading code. It's very rare that you're just reading at one file. It's just I don't want to do multiple files right now because I'll overwhelm you, right? That's all. But starting next week, guess what starts happening, right? Cool. Yeah, and so furthermore, like I would again look at, okay, valid month, don't need to worry about how it works. Valid date, don't need to worry about how it works. Just remember that these functions exist, or you know what, don't remember. When they're called, just go look them up, right? So this is basically the overall takeaway is naming is good and important because it allows us to use our human intuition. So as you're crafting code, write good names. Spend the time to think about good names because it'll help yourself in the future and others. And then also try to trace code as though JavaScript is running it. Okay, so as I mentioned, we're going to do an objects review and through a challenge. And I think we'll take the break after the challenge because I'm just thinking 25 right now, 25 after. If we do 30 minutes, that's 55 after. That's a good time for a break. Agreed? So before we get into objects, just as a good like conversation, forgetting languages like JavaScript or Ruby or whatever they may be. So I don't want a language-specific answer. What is software made of? That's still language, right? As in, it's not language, but like, I guess assembly is language, but ones and zeros is not language. But like, I guess that's a very technical answer. And I know my question's too vague, so I'm trying to think of a better way of framing my question. At a high meta level, not as a like physical level, at a meta level, what is software made of? Code is correct, but I want something more specific than code. Sorry. Say that again? Solving a specific problem is the goal of software, I agree. Right? It's user-centered. It's about like, what are we actually trying to do? And that's the kind of questions a good software developer or a good product owner will be thinking about. But that's more about like, why are we building software? Right? I want to know, at a meta level, what is it? What, you know, you can say variables and things like that, but like at a higher level. Logic? Yeah, so somebody mentioned LSD already? So there's one answer, which is like logic, syntax, or is it logic, syntax, data? I like that answer, but the way I like to think about it is that two major things. Those things are data, of course. Software is very data-centered. Information, right? It always operates on data. I can't think of any software that doesn't have data involved. Can you? Like, no matter what kind of software it is, right? It'll have data. And the other thing? Logic, fair. Logic is probably a good third answer, but I'm looking for another one. Behavior. It has things that it does. So it's operating on data and it's got actions. Do you agree? Behavior and data is what I think makes up software at a meta level. Now, agreed that logic is part of that. Logic is behavior, isn't it? Right? So, what did we say? Behavior, which is essentially encompasses logic, right? And data. So when we think about data, what do we think about? Information. Data is, I would say functions are more the behavior side, aren't they? Because that's like stuff is happening, a function does something. Right? Data, maybe you think about objects. That's data. But you think about variables, right? And then under behavior, you could have like conditionals, like if statements, loops, things like that, right? More logic stuff. So like within our first week, right, or within even these few days, we are covering the core of what makes software. And then everything else just builds from there, right? Because we've talked about, even in the prep course, we talked about objects, albeit a little bit. And this week, quite a bit of time with objects and functions. Right? Like those things, and getting comfortable with those, which takes a long time, right? These are just introductions, is going to be a big part of your learning journey, a big part of what is software. Okay? That's why it's important that we're spending time on this, because you might be wondering, like, objects, like we covered this already, why are we going more into objects? There's a lot that we need to learn about these things and get comfortable with using them. It's one thing to know the syntax and the features of objects in one language, and it's another to like use them properly and use them for like a solution where nobody's telling you that that's a good part of the solution, right? So here's the objects challenge, shall we? Ready for this? Whoops, wrong file. File 4. So here's the objects challenge that I was thinking. And we might even want to solve it without objects at first, because it's not like you need objects to solve them. I was thinking we'd write a function that takes in an array of characters. And the characters are like represent a string, like some kind of a message, right? Like hello. So it'd be like HELLO. And then it returns LeetSpeak as a new array for like encoding that message as like, you know, Reddit language or something. I don't know. So LeetSpeak, for those of you who don't know, is like elite speak, right? It's like 1337, right? No? Nobody? Some people? Okay. So we'll learn about what LeetSpeak is, but essentially we're encoding the string. Some characters like H will become a 4, or E will become a 3, which is like a 3 backwards, right? And it's just like a cool way of writing English that nobody really cares about, right? Awesome. I missed a few points from Victoria, but I think they covered what we were talking about, which is awesome. Look at what's being returned in logic. You guys aren't doing a good job of representing Victoria. I just want to say that right now. Okay. So how do we go about doing this? Create an object. No, not yet. We're going to actually solve it without objects first. So let's pretend objects don't exist as a thing or we don't need them. We're going to solve this challenge or kata. It's not super difficult, I don't think. It's about prep course level difficulty, perhaps, especially without objects. So we should be able to get through it pretty quickly. But I will let you guys also, I don't want to just solve it myself really quickly. So hopefully you guys are going to steer me in the right direction. Yeah, so let's actually define it. Well, we'll just define a few, right? I'll just say like H should be 4. And E should be 3. Huh? T is 7. We're not going to do all of it because I'm just too lazy. But yeah, you know what? We'll do T. Sure, we'll do T is 7. And we'll do L is 1. And we'll do O is 0. At least that'll cover like hello, right? If we were to test with that. We'll have to come up with something that has T in it, but whatever. Hello there. That'll cover it. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to return an array, which is going to say, instead of hello, it will say like 4, 3, 1, 1, 0, and then so on, right? How do I get started? Defining variables for them? Perhaps. You like start defining the mapping, right? I could, but I think that's. Yeah, or array in our case. So create a function that takes in an array, perhaps. Andy's already started talking a little bit about like errors first, right? Has he? Errors first, is that a thing that we've talked about already? Okay, so I'm going to start preaching. And this is like a different paradigm. It's a paradigm shift for how to approach these kind of problems. I call it, it's not an official name, but I call it error-driven development, or EDD. Okay, and it's part of like the dev approach. It's an approach. It's not like some kind of technical solution. And what I'm basically saying is like use errors to your advantage. And as you're writing code, think about code that will produce an error, or your action that will produce an error, and then solve just that problem. So I'm going to try and take an EDD approach and get 2 birds with 1 stone, where I'm solving this, introducing objects, but also introducing EDD. Okay? So this is what I would do. I would say the first step is actually run the file. Right? What am I expecting? And that's the other thing. Is always have a hypothesis or an expectation before you take the action. Even if you're wrong, it doesn't matter. Take a guess. What do you think will happen if I run this file? Nothing will happen, but there will be no error. Right? Normally, what I would do is actually run a file that does not exist and cause the error. Right? Or what I would suggest you do. And then next, I'm going to do something, ideally, that causes an error. What could it be? Exactly. Call a function that doesn't exist, because defining the function will not be an error, and it's hard to kind of test if it worked, right? But an error, I can see that there was a problem, and then I can fix it to make sure that my solution was hopefully in the right direction. So I'll actually call the function leetspeak and pass in. For now, I'll just pass in empty array because it doesn't really matter, and that's it. Right? That is my first step, actually. Very different than what you've probably been doing. Agreed? Not saying you have to do things this way. This is my recommended approach. Right? What do we expect will happen now? What will be the error? Function is not declared, or undefined, or not defined, or something like that, right? Doesn't have to be specific, exact words, but leetspeak is not defined. Sweet. My mental model on how JavaScript works is so far correct, right? This is a reference error. We're trying to reference something that does not exist. Okay, so now how am I going to solve this error? Exactly. Create that function. How far do I have to go? What's the minimum amount of code that I can write to make that error go away? Instead of trying to solve the 3 next step, I'm just going to solve this 1 step. Does it need to take in an argument? Depends on the language. In JavaScript, you're right. No. In another language, I would get another error, and maybe that's okay too, because again, we're moving from one error to the other, right? But in JavaScript, it's totally okay that it's not even bothering accepting that array. It's ignoring it, right? So this is the minimum amount of code that I can write to make that error go away. Cool, eh? Working incrementally. This one of the big generally agreed upon things in software development is work incrementally, and EDD is one way to force you to do that. Am I going too fast?
No.
Too slow?
No.
Okay, good.
Yeah, speed it up.
I don't care. Is it wrong? I think it is, right? My English not so good. Does that speak? All right. You know what? No. That's what we're going to do. And now it's still wrong, but whatever. It's not like they spell elite correctly anyway, right? So far, what am I expecting now? Am I expecting an error? No. What am I expecting as behavior? No output because there's no console log, right? What can I do next? Maybe console log, just make sure that I'm not like in some kind of weird state that I don't realize that I'm in. Right? Or maybe I want to be a little bit more, work towards the direction of like, okay, we'll take in something. And so we'll accept that thing. And we'll console log it. What have I done wrong so far? This is intentionally wrong. Wrong as in like, opinionatedly wrong. Not technically wrong. It works. What have I done wrong? I did it deliberately. But I don't think most of you picked up on it. In the back, what's your name again? Ina? Okay. I haven't returned anything, so that's another thing I wasn't thinking of. So it's supposed to return something, so you're jumping ahead. But there's something else that I did that's a little bit more nuanced. Victoria. Yes, vague input name. Thank you, Bryce. That's a terrible variable name. Array, like how am I supposed to understand? We just talked about reading code. Would array help you understand what the hell this function's about? Not really. So what would? Yeah, it could be something like English speak, but then speak doesn't really tell me much about the type, and unfortunately JavaScript doesn't have types, so we might want to just say English characters, something like that. I like that, English characters. Quite descriptive, not too verbose. Good job. And I expect to see an empty array there, right? Okay. What's next? It's supposed to return something. So let's go ahead and assign the return value to a thing. What would those things be called? Those would be leet cars or chars equals what's returned by leet speak. And console log it, so at least we get to see what it is, right? I know it's not 133t because 1 is not going to work. You can't start a variable with a number. That's why I'm starting with L, okay, in case you're curious. And yes, you could argue that's a terrible name. Why are there 3s in it? Come on, KV. But whatever, we're just being funny here. So far, so good? And what do I expect to see for this? It will call the function. So the function is actually being called up here. This is the function call. Seeing different answers. You in the back? Will it just give you the array still as a fair guess? Not correct, actually, but still. Why did you guess that? It's equal to the return value of leet speak, yes? We're not returning anything, exactly. So kind of, it's just a gotcha, right? What were you going to say? It's a good guess. And we will talk about reference to functions, but not in this case, because in this case, I'm calling the function, and the function is not returning anything. So in this case, John from Victoria, who's gotten one upvote, is correct, which is it's going to be undefined. Right? At the moment. Why is it undefined? Because in JavaScript specifically, again, this is language specific, but in JavaScript specifically, there is a hidden return undefined that your eye should automatically draw if they don't see a return. Because that's what JavaScript does. So far, so good? Working incrementally, right? Learning new things as we work. That's another benefit of working incrementally and doing error-driven development. You learn new things because your assumptions are often wrong or sometimes wrong. Cool. What do we do next? Create some variables. I feel like you're saying that just because variables sound cool.
Yeah, variables. I guess we're trying to fix one error, then return something.
Ideally, you want to cause an error, right? Or some kind of a problem. It doesn't have to be like like actual JavaScript error. Yep, in the back. Sure, yeah, that's a great idea. Return results. And my ID is a little bit smart. I wish it wasn't. Sometimes I know I should learn how to disable that before lecture. But anyway, this will fail with an error. What will the error likely be? Undefined, again, similar to that function call that wasn't existing, a reference error of some sort, right? And it will be on line 16. Starting to get comfortable with expecting to see line numbers and following them as well is a good result of this, right? So yeah, exactly. Line 16, right? And then we need to now fix that error. So how would you fix that error? What's your name? Alyssa. How would you fix that error? Yep. So like a const or something? We know we're supposed to return an array, I think we said. Returns an array, so an empty array. So now what I expect is, instead of the error, I'm going to see an array come back from the function as well. Now we can't tell here, but this is a different array. Maybe the next thing I'll do is just pass in something here, right? Just to see the difference. Because I would say my error or current problem is I can't tell the difference. I'm too lazy. That's good, right? I think I missed an L. Nobody pointed that out. I bet you guys were all chuckling inside. Who's this guy who can't even spell hello? So far, so good. Loop through your input string. We're getting there. Yep, we're getting there. Expect to see that first array to be different. Hypothesis confirmed, right? And I expect to see the second one to not have anything because it's an empty array. Right? Now what? Maybe now we take, I struggle with this name, MX Rosenthal. Mix Rosenthal. We're going to take their advice on looping through the input string. So maybe just loop right here. How do I do the loop? Just a quick review. Now, I can do the loop this way, absolutely, but there's ideally a better way of looping. I mean, this is a more powerful way of looping. It gives you a lot more flexibility, but I don't need that flexibility. I need to go from the beginning to the end. It's a simple loop. For of, exactly. For let. I is probably not the best name for the variable. Why not? It's not an index. I is acceptable for index, because it's like we just want to be lazy, but not acceptable for something else, right? Yep, char of, and I would argue maybe even like a letter, right? Like the char is not some kind of exclamation mark or something like that. Like it's likely a letter. For letter of, and you know what? I would actually argue that this should be letters. But that's debatable whether it should be letters or chars, so don't take my word for it. How's this looking? Good. And in this case, maybe a console log on letter. Right? Not exactly towards my solution. It's towards my solution, but it's not exactly doing the full solution. It's still working incrementally. Right? Not an error, though, in this case. So that's the unfortunate part here. Because I like errors. Oh, forgot to say the main value proposition of error-driven development. Right now, when you're doing software development, when you're writing small little apps, I bet you are nervous to hit enter because you're nervous to see an error. For most of you. Because society has trained us that when we see red or when we see an error, we've done something wrong. It's bad. Punished, right? Software development, you need to start thinking, you need to start erasing that. It's actually about using errors to your advantage. So that's, I think, the number one value proposition of error-driven development is it actually retrains you to not consider errors bad, but actually to embrace them. So when I run this, I expect to see all the letters on a separate line, along with the other outputs that we have already enabled. Great. And now I need to, instead of console logging them, I need to actually collect them into the array that we've defined as results. So how would I do that? Results dot push letter. Right? Now, this is not, again, the exact solution. I'm just working towards it. I know that this is kind of towards a solution, but not exactly correct. I'm actually writing incorrect code, but it's in a step in the right direction. What do I expect to see now? I've removed this, so I don't expect to see these console logs. What I expect to see is the results have the same letters, because unconditionally, I am putting each letter into the other returned array. So we expect to see this array, and then we expect to see the same thing in a different array. Agreed? And someone, Rosenthal from Victoria is saying now we're going to use a switch statement. We'll get there. So that looks right. And inside the for loop, we're going to start having to do some conditions, right? Because depending on the letter, we need to swap it out. So what can we do? What's the simplest stuff we could do here? Yeah. So if the letter is an H, I actually am not pushing in just a letter. I'm pushing in 4, right? That's the H. And just with this code, what do I expect to see? Not an error, but a problem. And the problem will be that I'll only see 2 things in that array, a 4 and a 4. Do we agree? Because it will go through that array for the first H, and for the last H, it will put in 4s. And so I'll just see 4, 4. It has no else condition, nothing else. So that's it. That's all that's going to go in there. I've actually stepped away from my solution a little bit, haven't I? But I'm still making progress. So this is point number 2. That oftentimes, especially as junior new learning developers, our temptation, as I've seen even from the Slack answers, is to like write the whole solution, to do multiple steps. What's wrong with that? Or what's not as ideal about that? It's not wrong, but it's not as ideal. Yeah, the more steps you take all at once, the more you might have to do like batch debugging, right? I just made that word up, but like debugging, trying to figure out how to unravel 5 different steps that you've done to figure out which one of those is the issue. And now you're being less lazy in a way, because now you're engaging more, you're doing more cognitive load there to try to figure out, right? So this makes it a little bit easier to debug as you go. And another takeaway there is like actually the fastest solution from point A to point B, not having the solution to having this thing completely implemented, is not a straight line. What you think is a straight line, right? Like just write steps towards the exact solution, but you'll notice I'm writing code that I actually end up throwing away, right? So it's actually that I'm like working towards a solution, but I'm actually kind of going in a zigzag, kind of. And that actually ends up being faster. Why is that faster? I'm writing more lines of code than I would have if I just did it all in one step. Because at each of those steps, I'm wasting less time. Okay. So here maybe I'll put in that else, which is to just put in if it's not any of those things, then just take the letter as is, because with something like, I don't know, R, we don't really want to replace that one, right? So maybe I'll put in something that won't get replaced. Right? Actually, a lot of stuff in here won't get replaced because we haven't mapped anything except for H's. So only the H's have become mapped. So far, so good, or going too fast? So far, so good. And then, of course, we'd have a bunch of else ifs here, right? If it's E, then I want a 3. If it's T, I want a 7. If it's L, I want a 1, and so on. I'm not going to implement all that. We have limited time here. But we get an idea of that, right? How would we fix this or improve this using objects? How would we refactor this? Aina? Yep. Nailed it. Absolutely. Outside of the function. Yeah, it's debatable whether it should be outside or inside. We'll do it outside in this case. Outside the function, we will define, so in the outer scope, we'll define a mapping or a dictionary from the English letter to the leet speak letter, right? What do you want to call it? And it's an object, so that's curly brackets. Keys are always strings, so that makes our life easier because we need them to be strings anyway. So that'd be an H, and we use colon in JavaScript for this. And then the value can be of any type, but we need strings back anyway for characters. And so that's going to be a 4. And we can do that a lot easier now with and now there's other edge cases to think about. We haven't talked about edge cases like capital letters and things like that. I'm going to keep this in limited time because it's not about logic, it's more about approach. I wanted to cover E to D and I wanted to cover objects. So I'm not covering all the edge cases intentionally, okay? So is this okay? Alrighty. And then we're going to use this now in here. Actually, my error-driven development approach should have been to use it instead of defining it first. So that was my bad. But you get the idea. Okay, so here, it's not as if the letter is an H manually tested, because we can't manually test it anymore. Because what happens there is we're just going to have a growing and growing if statement, else if, else if, else if, right? We don't want to do that. We just want to have that one. Is it found in the mapping or not? If it's not, then we'll just resort to the else statement that's already here. So we need to use the object in this situation here. Agreed? So what will we do here? What am I replacing this with? I'm going to need to test the letter. I'm going to test that the letter is inside the object. How do I do that? Something like this? No, that's pseudocode. That's English. It's fine if you're drafting it like that. It's fine if that's the comment, but that's not valid JavaScript. What am I doing? Yeah, so object, which is this right here. And then you're suggesting .keys. But can't I just try to access it by the letter and see what comes back? So can't I just do square brackets? First of all, can I do dot? Can I do this? My tone suggests otherwise, doesn't it? Why can't I do dot letter to see what comes back? Because I expect if it's H, I want to see the 4 come back. Letter is not a key. This is literal. It is literally going to look for a letter in there. I want to use the variable letter, which contains an H or an E or so on. And so therefore, I need to use square brackets. What comes back from an object when the key is not there? And I try to look up that key. Undefined is correct. How do we validate that? If you're not sure, this is another dev approach thing. It's OK. If you're not sure, open up a REPL, test it out. Here's my object. It has 2 keys or properties. And I'm trying to access K. I expect to get back capital K. Agreed? What happens if I try to access Z? Well, I don't know. My hypothesis is it's an error. In other languages, that could be an error. In JavaScript, it's not an error. It gives you a value of undefined back. Okay? So you learned something if you didn't know. And now you can go back to your app where it's easier to just kind of, now that you have that knowledge, you can apply it. So if this is undefined, great. It's going to just go into the else, because undefined is falsy. And if it's not undefined, i.e. it's a letter, that's a value, and that's truthy. So that will go into the if statement. So I say, OK, Once I have that letter, I just need to, again, do that same operation to get that letter, which is going to be a 3 or a 4 or whatever, and push that into the array. Right? You guys with me? Now, this starts to look confusing to people, especially who are not used to seeing a lot of nested expressions. So it's OK if you're like, you know what, too confusing to read this. I'm actually going to take this and call that the new letter or something, or the leet letter, right? And I'm going to assign that here to, that way it's like, yes, it's more code, but it's easier to follow maybe for you. That's OK too. Now, one of the things you might notice, some of you, is here I'm doing this operation twice. One in the if statement and once again to get that value. So I'm doing 2 lookups from the object when really I only need to do 1 lookup. So what can I do to improve this? Yes. So I'm tempted right now as I write code to refactor it. And that's not a bad thing. Okay? But I haven't run this code yet. So if I assume that it runs, first run it, make sure it's working, then refactor. Again, that 1 step at a time thing. So I'm going to run this, and I expect what to happen is that I'm pretty much at my solution. Right? Which is that it's, I mean, unless I've got some typo or logic error in here, it's going to find it or not find it and behave accordingly. Okay? And then results are already coming back. Results are already being output. Does that look right? Thank you for pointing that out, Benjamin. There's actually different lint rules. Some lint rules allow for that last comma, and others don't. I think our lint rules allow it, which is why it's like not technically invalid. So this is getting into opinion line. But yeah, I'll remove that comma. And that's acceptable as well. But yeah, so now we can refactor this. So I just think that this can be moved, that this can be moved up. And I'm already running this exact expression below, and I'm already got the value of it here. And so I can just say, if there's a letter that was found, then great, use that letter. Otherwise, just put in the original letter into the array. I went about 8 minutes over time here. Not terrible, still on track-ish. Did we get a lot of value of this? What did we learn from this? We actually focused less on objects and more on approach, but we still learned a bunch of stuff, hopefully. So if you could, please. Yeah. So we covered incremental development is, I would say, for lack of a better word, or words. Is that spelled correctly? OK. Let's call it a holy grail. Is that a thing? There are many holy grails, but this is one of them. And as a form of incremental development, errors are your friend, not your enemy. Enemy, right? I spelled that right. But we don't believe this yet. We haven't subconsciously agreed this, followed this rule yet. And so EDD allows us or forces us to fix or follow both of those rules. Right? We also learned that, what about objects? We should talk about objects here. Objects in JS can be used as dictionaries / maps. These are actually official tech terms. In other languages, they're actually called dictionaries. I would argue that in JavaScript it's a bit conflated. The language actually confuses us a little bit. Whereas in other languages, objects are a separate thing and dictionaries are a separate thing. In JavaScript, there's actually a thing called maps, but nobody uses them because they came out too late. Or at least so far, very few people use them. It actually exists. Oh, no, not here. Map. as a type. Right? It's an object that holds key value pairs. That's exactly what we need, key value pairs. But we're just not in the habit of using them. The community still hasn't converged to that, so we're still using objects for maps. Why are they called maps? They're not like navigational maps or charts. They are mapping a key to a value. Dictionaries is another one, if I could only spell it right. Dictionaries, there we go. And in Python, they're called dictionaries. And various other languages, they're called dictionaries. Okay. In Ruby, they're called hashes, which is terribly named. But long story there, you can look it up. Which really means mapping keys to values. Right? All right, so with 11:02, we'll take a break, and we'll spend essentially from now, or let's say 11:10, until the end of lecture 12, on functions and callbacks. See you in 8 minutes. Thank you. What are you working?
Whereabouts in Toronto?
I grew well. High school years were like Mississauga,
Yeah.
and then which I hate.
Yeah, yeah.
And downtown for like work for the
Oh,
most
that's
part.
cool.
Oakville for work for the beginning. It was cute.
I like Oakville.
Oakville's yeah, especially like the Lakeshore part,
Mhm.
Trafalgar and all that.
Yeah.
But that's my work was at Lakeshore and Trafalgar. Like what a nice
That's a cool
intersection.
place to
Yeah.
work.
That was for like a year and a half, and then downtown for all of that. So we moved. My wife and I moved to Yonge and Lakeshore, and then eventually Bathurst.
Okay, cool.
So, right downtown, but like still kind of on the edge.
Yeah.
And not as many nice things around. Like it's still a little bit of a commuter area if you think
Yeah.
about it, right? Like there's not much around there. It's pretty desolate, except for like you're on Lakeshore and Queens Quay area. So
Yeah,
there's
yeah,
like
okay.
some nice things there. I'm guessing you're from there.
After Calgary, I moved to Toronto for.
Okay.
Okay.
Did you like Toronto?
Yeah, I did. I mean, Services downtown. Not the healthiest place, but
Is it like a restaurant or?
yeah, exactly.
Which restaurant?
It was called Pravda. Vodka bar as well.
Yeah, I know Pravda. That's
Yeah,
like
so-
the fancy one that I never entered. It was in. It was on Wellington, I think.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
so it's right. It's actually
It looked
like,
very fancy.
It's right across the street. I worked at both. Same owner.
Okay.
Yeah. After a little while.
And so Pravda, and then the other one was which one?
It's called Woods.
Woods sounds familiar as well.
Yeah, it's like if you went to the back alley behind Wellington.
Ah, okay. Okay.
the name is tiny.
Okay.
But yeah.
Yeah, I miss the food in Toronto. I think
Yeah.
Vancouver is it's not even in the running.
No, it's really. I live in Richmond now. Asian food is really, but besides
Yeah.
Asian.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sushi's great, but like that's cheating. You have
Yeah.
you know good access to
There's,
good fish and
the
stuff.
food is not the same.
Ramen is good here. Like there's definitely good like Asian food
Asian
here.
food.
But it's also good there. Like Toronto
Yeah.
has good sushi. It has good ramen.
True.
At least these days. I miss like the good like Ossington Strip. Like some amazing food there.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's so. I was living on and then when I.
Queen West.
Yeah, exactly.
Nice.
Well, almost more into Parkdale than like the.
Still, that's a good area now.
There was every single place, what should be a tiny little one-off restaurant.
Yeah, even the ones that closed down, you're like, why did that close down? It was so good.
There's just so.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely miss. Every day, try something. You get.
Yeah, I go back to Toronto. I'm going again in February, but like for work.
Yeah.
But like I don't get the time to like
Explore.
step outside of that like few blocks of work, right, for lunch.
You have family out there?
Yeah,
Yeah, okay.
yeah. But my trips are so short that I don't get too much time.
You're really just going there for work.
I get like one evening. And this time what I'm trying to do is like as soon as I get there that evening, Sunday night, like 6 p.m. I land and I'm trying to go to like Mississauga for food because like a lot of good Indian food, like Pakistani food,
Yeah.
can't get here in Vancouver.
Yeah.
But you can find really good Pakistani food in
Really?
Mississauga area nowadays.
Okay.
So in Calgary too, by the way.
Really?
Yeah. So Calgary, I didn't realize this until I just Googled it and like looked up places, and I was like, holy crap, it's like authentic Pakistani food. Can't find it in Vancouver. It was actually better than Toronto, I found.
Huh.
Yeah. I guess there's just a population there. But
What
they're
a thought. In
yeah.
Calgary.
Calgary, well, suburbs,
Yeah.
right?
Okay.
Of course, but
Yeah.
like still,
I
it's acquired taste.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think it's the best food in the world, but that's because it's nostalgic for me,
Okay.
right? Yeah. But like friends of mine that have tried, they're like, okay, this is like different. It's very spicy. It's very like a lot of spices,
Okay.
and very like unhealthy food generally. Like
Okay.
a lot of like street food esque kind of vibe.
That's stuff.
Yeah. 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 I love street food. Like Thailand was awesome for that. Yeah. Sorry, Kevin, you were gonna say
Yeah.
subcategory?
I mean, spaghetti code.
I don't know what that is.
Like, if you just get an error and you point become like
Spaghetti code. Yes, it doesn't solve all problems. It's one of the approaches you should be using. It's not the
I'm
only
just
approach.
worried, like after a while, the code everything by like off by one.
No, because you're solving the errors as you're going. So an error isn't just like a JavaScript error as we saw. It's like, oh, I'm getting an off by one error. Okay, like I'm gonna fix that now.
No, it
Right?
just feels like everything gets.
I'd say, okay, so my overall answer is there are other strategies you have to use. For example, refactoring. as we did here, but it's a very small refactor where we assigned it to a variable and then used it as you go. And that allows you to not have spaghetti code, because refactoring should lead to you thinking about the quality of your code, not just the solution. So it's just one of the mechanisms to use. Now, does EDD resonate with everybody? Does everybody use it after they graduate bootcamp? I don't know. I still like to evangelize it. And whenever I talk to other senior developers about it, they're like, yeah, like essentially what it is I haven't told you yet, but EDD is TDD without writing tests. And TDD is like most people agree is a good thing. Not most people don't do it, but most people agree it's a good thing. And EDD is just saying like, okay, before we learn about writing automated tests, let's just do TDD's philosophy. And we'll talk about TDD this weekend anyway. So.
Is this approach that like your level?
Yep. Especially when I'm learning new stuff. So if I'm like learning Elixir just over the holidays or whatever, I like specifically want to like learn. The happy path is like easy. It's like what's actually like errors actually give you insight. I forgot to say this. Errors also give you insight into how the language works, right? Like reference error. Oh, so next time I see reference error, I think I'll understand what that means, right? It actually gives you like, it's not just, my theory is every single tutorial introducing anything, any language, is actually written incorrectly. Because they say, create a file, write this line of code that does hello world, run the file. And it's like, everything just works. And it's like, no, it should actually be like error driven. Yeah. That to me is a better tutorial. But we are also guilty of not doing things that way in our tutorials that we give you, right? So it's a newer philosophy that I've had.
A bit off-putting if the first thing you ever do, like without understanding the philosophy behind it, if you've never.
I would argue that it wouldn't be off-putting, but I'm not sure. Maybe for like, hey, I just want to learn like how to get this thing working. Yeah. Then yes. But I think people would generally appreciate that philosophy for the most part. Maybe there should be both alternatives, right? Here's like the traditional, and then here's the error-based one or something. But of course, that's too much work, and people are lazy. Oh shit! It's already 13 after. Oh, and you fixed your name. Thanks, Max. Now I know what to call you. And no problem. I actually tested it, and I realized the mic was on, and that wasn't a bad thing. I wasn't talking bad stuff about you guys, so we're good. All right, everybody there is good to go. Everybody here is good to go-ish, so we'll start. We'll resume. Okay. So 5, 6, and 7 are what we're going to cover. First one is functions as values. Are we good to go? Feeling all right? Bio break done? So functions as values, what does this mean? It's a bit of a review, but it's important as a foundational thing to understand and talk about callbacks. So this one, I don't want to spend time building the function, so I already have it written down. Here's a function. It just returns a string. And instead of just being a static string, it's a dynamic string. So if I pass in KV, it'll say hello KV, right? And it won't say it, like it won't console log it. So it's nice in that way in that it's returning the string, and then it lets me decide if I want to console log it. Right? Pretty simple, nothing fancy. So if I console log greet KV, I expect to see hello KV, console logged by line 8. Agreed? If I just did this, I would expect to see no output because there's no console logging happening anywhere. So I don't think we need to spend time on that. But here we are, making sure that this actually does work as advertised. And it does. OK. So my question, I guess, multiple questions. My question is, first question is, what happens if I do, there's a bunch of different takeaways from this exercise, not just one. What happens if I do this? This is more of a JavaScript specific question as a digression, but I'll ask it anyway. What happens if I do this? It's a good guess that it will complain because there's no input. And most languages will do that, but JavaScript's crazy and it lets you do that. I don't know why. And so it will actually say, hello, undefined, because it converts the value undefined to a string, like the word undefined. So it's concatenating undefined, and it's like, OK, I guess I got to turn that into a string, which is really bizarre, but just good to know, right? And how did I come across that? By playing around and going, what if, right? So this is encouraging you to do the same thing. OK, next question is, what do I do? What happens if I just console log greet, but not do the parentheses thing, the brackets? What's your name again? Calvin? I think so too. Yeah, go on. It won't call the function because the parentheses are the function call, and therefore the greet here is a reference to the function, and therefore we'll see it try to output the description of the function or something. There you go. You're pretty spot on, right? It is actually the reference to the function. It's interesting. Not really what you're likely doing, but trying to output the value of like the actual function itself instead of the return value of the function. But it is something that you can do as part of your debugging practice, right? Or just inspection. Like, am I on the right page here? Like, it's just throwaway code, but like, still good to be able to console log a function. Agreed? Okay, that's interesting. And also what's nice is that the output actually tells you not only that this is a function, but the function has a name. The function has a name, which is greet. Right? Here's another question. What happens if I say this? Because here, I'm not calling the function. Yet again, just like console log above, I'm not calling the function. I know that greet, that word, that bare word greet, is a reference to the function. Right? So the right side of this new line is the function. So what will happen here? Is this an error or something else? It's okay to be wrong. You're taking a guess. What do you think is happening here? It will make a new reference to the same function is a possible answer. Other guesses? Say hello could be undefined. What makes you say that? Right, but we know that here is a function. It's not undefined, right? So likely I would say it could be, but I don't think it will be undefined. Because unless I did something like this, right? Or if I had a variable on the right side that was undefined, right? Not a bad guess, though. Others? So what do I expect to see as the output here, then, if you think it's going to be a reference to the function, a new reference to the function, as you said? Same thing as before? Nailed it. Good, really good. Did you already know that, or did you guess? Oh, did you? Okay, interesting. May have been in the stretch or maybe in the tail end. I don't think everybody got there, right? Maybe I'm mistaken. But anyway, so what did we see here? We saw that it's still the function greet. It's not even the function say hello, as some people guess. So what was your name? Jake was spot on when he said it's a new reference. So it creates a new variable, which is a reference. But the function is still the same. It doesn't create a new function. He was very careful with his words, right? If he had said it's a new reference to a new function, that would have been wrong, right? Or only partially right. And Max was on to the same thing. Awesome. So what do we learn here is that functions are actually values, and they can be passed around to other values or to other variables, right? In fact, I want to show you this visually, if that's okay. There's a tool. You might have come across it already. It's called Python Tutor. Have you come across it? I don't think we've introduced it yet. We introduce it usually around week 1 sometime. Doesn't really matter. And it's called Python Tutor, so what the hell are we doing with it? It's also got a JavaScript version. It helps you learn JavaScript as well, JavaScript Tutor. And what you can do is you can paste code in here, and it will let you step through the code and visualize it. It's pretty cool. It's been around for a long time, as you can tell from the UI. Like, it's not anything pretty. But it works really well. So here I've got the timeline of the code. I can drag that along, but I'll just click the next button and go step by step. Okay? So of course, it's on the first line, which is line 4. So it sees the function. It does not go into the function because we haven't run the function yet. It goes on to line 8, as we would expect, that we talked about earlier on, right? And a result of that is, in the global scope, we have greet as a reference, as a variable, and the variable contains a pointer to another piece of memory, which is where the function is defined. And so we see that arrow here. Pretty cool, eh? And then next line, not that useful. We're just going to console log it, and it just puts it out here. Now, you'll notice that the console log is a little bit different than what we saw in our terminal. Different things will give you a different kind of output when it comes to outputting values, like functions and things like that. Some will be syntax highlighted, like green and red. Some will be all black, that kind of thing. And so in this case, it's actually not very useful. And then we have the next line, which we're curious about, say hello, which assigns itself to greet. And what do we see? It's what, sorry, what was your name again? Jake? It's what Jake said. New reference, new variable, 2 variables now in memory. And these variables point to the same function. Right? We never call the function, and so we never really hit line 5. Pretty cool tool. I suggest using it, but I suggest not becoming dependent on it. You're supposed to do this in your head. So maybe past week 2, do not use this thing, or use it very little if you're stuck on something and you really need to verify, but don't use it as a crutch. Any questions so far about this stuff? Awkward pause. Nothing? So far it's pretty clear. Okay, great. The next thing we can talk about, so functions values, we can just maybe do a quick review here. We can reference functions by their name. Don't use parentheses. Node will output them as function, how is it? Function greet. We can assign functions, since they're values, so it allows us to treat our functions as values, right, as data. JavaScript allows that. Not all languages allow that as easily. Ruby, for example, doesn't do that as easily. It doesn't just allow you to refer to a function and pass it around. Some languages, it's a design choice. And in this case, with JavaScript, functions are at the core, and therefore the more you can do with functions, the better. Okay? The official term for this is JavaScript. In JavaScript, functions are first-class citizens. Whatever. You might come across that in terms of technical explanations or conversation. Yep.
So in JavaScript, basically, when we try to print up, the output is decided by the interpreter?
The output is decided by the interpreter is the question. I think the reason you're asking that question is because the output is different.
Yeah.
Yes. So the output is different here. If I run the same code in DevTools, which you play around with in the prep course, because so you know that you can run JavaScript in the console here, right? That's also a JavaScript interpreter. Let's take that same JavaScript and run it here. And we see that it doesn't say function greet, actually prints out the function details. So every single interpreter, all 3 that we've looked at, Python Tutor, Node, as well as DevTools, all behave slightly differently when it comes to showing you the output of some kind of internal value. So the answer is yes. Yep. Can you just explain what it means when you say functions are first-class citizens? It's actually kind of a vague term. I think I'll struggle to explain it. It really just means that functions are at the core of a lot of things, of everything maybe, is one way to think about it. Is that the more you just think in terms of functions. You don't just think in terms of functions to be able to do behavior, but you actually think in terms of functions as data as well. We talked about at the beginning of lecture as their software is made up of 2 things, behavior, which we identified as functions, and data, which we identified as numbers and strings and objects. But we actually start to realize that in first-class citizen languages like this, where functions are first-class citizens, these behavior things can actually be treated like data. So there's a crossover almost. Right? Yeah.
So basically, when you said Python interpreter, it's interpreter.
No, sorry, there's no Python in here. I apologize for the confusion. This site allows you to do Python, but also JavaScript. It's using a JavaScript interpreter.
So
Yeah.
I see. For Node, for example, let's use Node. What language is Node written in?
I think we're going a little bit off course with that question. It is C, C++, but we won't go into that stuff.
Fine. So
Yep.
basically, like, for some of those little things, what happens depends on the interpreter.
Absolutely. Like it's up to the the question is what some of these things are up to the discretion of the interpreter. They're trying to follow a specification, which is like JavaScript behaves this way, but they have some discretions in terms of like helping you out. So, for example, outputting what a function looks like. Well, that's open interpretation, right? This thing draws square brackets. The other thing shows you the contents of the function. Some decide to color it. Some decide not to color it. Things like that.
Who decides what interpreter to use? Is it the browser or the HTML page? The browser?
Who decides what interpreter to use?
Yeah. Is it based on the browser?
Can we take some of these questions offline if that's okay? Can I enforce the mute thing? Sorry, just because we're going, I'm very cognizant of time and I already went over time on the first half. Is that okay? Sure. Good questions though. I just, you know. Okay, so where were we? We finished here. Functions are first-class citizens. We realized that when we were able to pass them around in variables, and we can see that even more in number 6 here, which is we can actually pass functions around more than just into variables. Can you guess where? Objects is a great one. We saw that in the tail end of yesterday with the music library. Right, because we had like these methods, which are essentially just functions that are attached to properties. Now, in the case of this lecture, because we're talking about callbacks, I'm not going to bring objects back into the conversation. But that's absolutely a good answer. There's another one that I'm looking for. Yep. Remind me your name again? Alyssa, yep. Within functions, absolutely. They can be passed around not only to variables, but also into functions. So here's just some crazy function. I don't know, it just returns 5. I don't really care. Just an example, right? And I can actually have another function. Now, this is not a practical example. I'm just showing you the technology, and then we'll talk about practical examples, OK? Which actually takes in data, right? And we can call that whatever we want. It's a local variable. But actually, it's going to be a function. Because functions can be data. And so it will, let's say just for now, console log that function. How would I call another func to pass in the function f? I would just literally refer to f, just like I referred to greet in the other example. This is not much different than the previous exercise, where we just passed it to a variable. In this case, we're passing it into a function. Same deal, right? Passing it around in different ways. You with me so far? What do we expect this to output in that console log on line 8? 5 is a good guess, but not correct because we are not calling the function. Calling the function f, which would invoke line 4, is this with the parentheses. These are key. This is calling the function and in getting us the return value by running line 4. But we don't call the function. Right? Sorry? Yes, it will just say square brackets, because in Node it says square brackets function, colon, and then the name of function. Name of function is what? F, exactly, because that's how it was defined initially as. So let's take a look. You're right. Now, if I did this, if I wanted to call the function, I would say f with the parentheses right after it. And what would that actually pass in to another func? It would pass in 5 because it would run f in order to figure out what's happening. And this is another thing about reading code that we talked about earlier. When I look at this code, and when some of you look at this code maybe already because you have some practice, what I want you to do is not see just f brackets there. My eyes actually indirectly, because I've so many years of doing this, I actually see 5 here. I'm evaluating this line of code just like JavaScript is evaluating it. In order to pass in the value, it needs to run this expression. It runs this expression, and in place of that line, it replaces it with 5, and then it runs that. Okay? That is a metaphor for what's happening, or a high-level explanation of what's happening. It's not exactly what's happening, but good enough. right? So here we get to see 5 because it got 5 passed in. But we are talking about not passing in numbers. We're talking about passing in functions. And I mean, of course, you can pass in a function that takes in a function that takes in a function. It can get pretty crazy and rabbit holey. But you want to make things not difficult. So I'm not going to go into those kind of crazy examples right now. Are you guys with me so far? Any questions? Kevin, we'll get to you in a sec, but let's ask, what was your question in the back? What was your name, sorry? Leon, yeah?
Could we also call the function inside of another function?
Yeah, that's a good question. So can I just call f here? Oh, inside of the console log, you could, yeah, absolutely. I forgot to mention that. That's a key point. It's a function. You can call it there, right? Or maybe not in the console log right before it or something, but inside that function, inside another func, I have access to a function. Therefore, I can invoke or call it using these parentheses. That was the whole point I forgot to make. Thanks. Anything from Victoria? Awesome. OK, making progress. Now let's talk about real problems. OK, we haven't talked about callbacks yet. What are these things? And I'm not just going to go ahead and define callbacks next. I'm actually going to show a problem, and then we're going to solve it. And we're going to understand the need for callbacks as a result, hopefully. OK? So in this one, we just basically realized that functions can also be OK, so let's actually look at file 7, which I aptly named the pain, because we're going to try to experience the pain or the problem, and then we're going to try to understand how to solve it. Okay? So here's just some array of values, and we're going to do something really simple like print each one to the screen. We're going to write a function that prints each one to the screen. OK? And we're going to call that function. So let's call that function print each. Seems like a reasonable name. And it takes in the, I'm not doing this with EDD. I want to go a little bit faster. Like faster as in lecture faster, not like debugging faster, right? So hopefully you're with me on that one. So here they're going to be names. And these are instructor names in case you didn't guess. I'm assuming you haven't had Carl yet. He's on vacay. And usually he does later lectures. And there's a few others as well. And what am I going to do here? I'm going to loop, right? Using a for of. And I'm going to console log name. Doesn't that solve my problem right there? Again, I didn't do iterative development or incremental development, and I didn't do EDD. Skipping that for now for just getting to the core of this thing, right? And then I would run this. And oh, I went on into console log. I just run it, right? And pass in the names. One of the things I'm doing bad here is I'm taking in the same value name. Like this should be a different variable name. So what do you want to call these words? Because the function doesn't care if they're names. It's just like print each. I don't care if they're names. They're just words. They could be a sentence, right? So that's what it's doing. And we're going to go ahead and run that. And what do we expect? We expect each of those to appear on a separate line because it's a console log for each of them. So nothing crazy. And this is just to start the conversation. So here's the conversation. The question is, how many things is this function doing? How many things is it responsible for? Or what is this function responsible for? Printing each name is like the obvious answer here. But breaking that down a little bit. Yeah, so looping through the names. There's one more. Well, I guess it kind of is implied in looping through the names because it has to loop through them and it needs the access to them. Printing them. Right? There's a loop and then there's the print. Now, we know from reading in our assignment or in our readings at some point the best practices for functions that ideally functions are responsible for one thing. In fact, I would argue, so not only is this not doing that, it's doing two things, but I would argue that even the name is misleading. It's like essentially loop and print each, right? I mean, it's kind of implied, I guess, but like if we were really being serious about this, right? How can we make it not do both things? Create another function is a great answer. It's a step in the right direction. And looping and printing from John and Victoria, thank you. We're not keeping a good eye on Victoria. Can we help, please? I don't know why I'm punishing you for like volunteering or whatever, but so you're right. Like we need to create a function. What are we going to call that function? I think this one should be responsible for the looping, and the other one can be responsible for the printing. And I know printing, it's like one line of code, so like why would we create a function? But it could be, you could think about it like a more complicated printing thing, right? Where like it formats it nicely or something like that. There's more logic involved. For now, there's not, but you get the idea. So yeah, we're going to call another function, maybe print item. And it takes in a word or an item, right? Let's call it print word. All it does is print the word. Again, it could be more complicated. We're just keeping it simple. This is a step in the right direction because what is this going to do? It's going to take responsibility for printing the word. And now the other function doesn't have to know how it gets printed. It doesn't need to know that console log is a thing. So what are we going to replace here? We're going to replace line 17, second responsibility, with just calling the function. I would argue that the problem is not solved yet. You might be like nodding because you're like, problem solved. It's not. And I'll tell you why. I would say, you know how I said I'd argue that this is loop and print each? Because that's what the end result of this function is. It's looping through each and it's printing each. Are we feeling comfortable after having done this refactor, which of course I have to copy paste here, and of course works still, just as before. Are we feeling comfortable calling this function simply like all it does is loop? Can we say that it doesn't actually print them? No, it's still doing two things, isn't it? It's just not doing them directly. It's just doing one of those things indirectly. So it's a step in the right direction. It at least doesn't know how to worry about doing that. Like now it's not implementation, but it's like indirect, right? It's not responsible for doing it, but it's still accountable for it getting done. Is that a fair statement? And I would still argue we have not satisfied that rule that functions should only do one thing, because it's still doing two things. It's just indirectly doing the second. And this becomes more noticeable. And this, why is this a problem, KV? Like it looks fine. It's readable. It's manageable. There's no problems here. And you're right. In a small file like this, in a small app, this is fine. There's nothing wrong here. But we're talking about software engineering where we have hundreds, thousands of lines, thousands of files even, and we have a lot of repetition as a result, and we want to avoid repetition. I'll show you a simple example of that repetition right now. It goes like this. Well, what if we want to actually also do something else with these names? We want to loop through them and write each one to a separate, I don't know, to a file or something like that. We don't know how to do that. I'm not going to do that here, but I'm just going to pseudocode that. This is what it would look like. I'm just going to copy this, and it would be like loop and save each to disk or something like that. And it would just basically do this, except instead of calling print word, what would it call? It wouldn't need to worry about how to do FS or file system type stuff. It would just say something like, I'm going to call a function that does that, right? And save word would be responsible. Instead of using console log, it would just have some code to like use file system code to save the word to disk. Right? And so we have two functions here that both loop over that array, right? And all they're doing differently is what? The second one. The second thing that they happen to be also responsible for or accountable for. Do you see it? But there's shared code here. They're both looping through the thing. How do I dry this up? By dry, do you know what I mean? Don't repeat yourself, right? It's currently wet. What is wet? Write everything twice. Like that, eh? I didn't come up with it. It's pretty cool, though. So currently, we're writing everything twice. In this case, everything refers to the looping. And we want to not repeat ourselves in that fashion, right? I realize I'm talking pretty fast. So I'm going to slow down a little bit. Are we doing OK in terms of pace? We have about 20 minutes left, so ample time to actually get to the meat of things. Actually, we are in the meat of things. Anything from Victoria? Looking good. So just to recap, can somebody else tell me the problem that we've identified? Name again? Sorry, terrible. Jake? I've written a looping code twice. And in both cases, the functions have a problem. That problem isn't like that they don't work, but the problem is that they do two things, which is looping and doing the operation on the word, some kind of op on the word. Yeah, I would agree. That is the solution that we're getting to, and that's where callbacks come in. A couple of things before we get there, though. What was I going to say? I'll leave it. But yeah, so ultimately what we're looking to do is fix this. And we realize that the shared code here is that both of these are calling a different function. Oh, another thing that's not good about this is not only is it calling the function, but it needs to know the name of the function. So if I was to take this out of this code and use it in some other script or application, it wouldn't work because print word has to come along. It's coupled with print word. Right? And the same is true of the other one. So as it turns out, what we really want is what you described, Jake, which is like a loop and do each. And do is like a generic thing. And it doesn't care what the do operation is. It could be print, it could be save, it could be reverse, it could be whatever. And it will just take in the operation, because we just learned in the last exercise that you can pass in functions. So why don't we just pass in a function? And so that's what we're going to do. But instead of actually implementing this, first we're going to see that it already exists. And we're going to learn about it. And that is in file 8. That we actually already have a function in JavaScript that exists. You might have already come across it in documentation, and we might have already used it. It's called for each. Are you comfortable with for each already? Have you come across it? Maybe, maybe not. All right, it's another type of looping that you should be comfortable with, which goes like this. Item's a terrible name, I know. And just for sake of like understanding that it is indeed, just to see. There we go. So we're outputting each item on its own line. And I actually just made use of callbacks, and I've made use of this generic function that you've described here, Jake, which is it's a function that takes in a function. And it is the do action. What do you want to do with this thing? That function that I've defined in line here at line 6 is the equivalent of what we defined in the previous file, which is print item. It just doesn't have a name. Right? It doesn't have a name. I didn't say like function something. But ultimately, it's still a function. So what this will do is what we expect, or what I expect, which is that it will go through and print out each. It's just like our for of, except it's a slightly different syntax. And it's a function that takes in a function, whereas for of is not a function, nor does it take in a function. But it's a very common way. You'll come across code like this all the time that loops through things. Now, if this is confusing to read, and you're like, ah, like what's going on here? All right, let's make it simpler. What is it? Print item we called it last time? Or print word? That's the function, right? I just copy pasted it right there, or cut pasted it right there. Gave it a name, just like you're comfortable with. And now what am I going to do? Pass it in, just the name of the function. I'm not going to call it. I'm going to let it call it. I'm going to let for each call that function. I see a lot of silence and no head nods or anything, so I'm wondering if I've lost people, if they're just tired, or if this is just like, yeah, this makes sense. Yeah.
So in that items for each print word, you wouldn't have to call the print word with parentheses or brackets.
If you called print word, to answer you, so the question was about like calling it with parentheses, right? Yeah. If you call print with parentheses, then you have to give it a word. You have to give it like one of them. And then at that point, you're looping yourself. Now this function is responsible. It's called for each because it loops like a for loop. And so it's looping, and so I'm going to let it call it for each of those words.
Yeah, so that's just going to call the list and print it out like you did before.
Yeah. How many times is for each calling print word in this file? 4 times. So this is a function that is being called back 4 times. Do we agree with that conclusion at the bottom there? Notice how I threw in the word callback without properly defining it. I like to think that it's a fairly self-explanatory word, especially in the narrative that I've already laid out in front of you. But tell me if it's not. Yeah. It's another function that is called back, and we don't call it ourselves. By we, I mean the things outside of for each, right? The lines outside of for each. An analogy I like to use is like, let's look at these functions as people, right? And I need something done, so I'm the outer scope here, and you're your function. What's your name again? James. James, you're going to be the for each function, but you're for each generic, right? You don't actually do the specific thing. You just know how to like go through a pile of things, right? So I'm going to say, hey James, here's a pile of resumes, okay? And I want you to tear each one of them up, okay? Right? Tear resumes. And so I'm actually giving you the instruction as a function. Like you already know what tear each means, but like I'm describing, okay, I want you to like physically tear just half, right? Like I don't want you to shred it. I don't want you to run it through a shredder. Just one half tear for each resume, right? And make a sound like rah every time you do it, right? That's my description of how to tear each resume, give it to you, and that function now, you're calling that function multiple times on each of those resumes, right? Yep. Ask the question again. The first part I didn't catch. Yes. Yeah. I am. No. So sorry for confusing there. So the question's about parentheses again and calling the function. I am calling a function here. Which function is being called on line 10? Nope. On line 10, there's a function being called. The way we know is that there's parentheses, but it's around. But the word before it is for each. I'm calling for each, and what I'm passing into for each is another function, but I'm not calling that function. It's being called back later. That's the difference. So I'm still passing in a function by calling a function, just like I did in file. Which one was it? 5, 6. I was calling, this is my for each equivalent, and I'm passing in the callback function f. In this case, print word. Right? Same pattern. Now, one of the things I want to say is, like, I've shown you how for each works, but in traditional lecture fashion, as you've seen me do, we're going to actually implement what a for each would look like. So how does this actually work internally? That's the last step for the lecture. And how much time do we have left? 10 minutes? Perfect. So let's go ahead and do that in file 9. And what we'll do is, instead of for each itself, because we already have that available in JavaScript, we'll do something that's not available in JavaScript, which is like for each in reverse or for each backward. You can't, doesn't exist. So what we'll do is we'll actually create something useful. Okay? And again, we start off with some words. And our function is going to be looking like this. Again, not doing EDD or anything like that, but you'll see me use it in future lectures when we have a purpose for it. So for each backward. And what will it take in? Of course, the words, but we'll call that items here, right? And I'm working still incrementally, so I'm going to actually do this the wrong way, and then I'm going to do it with callbacks. Okay, I'm going to do it the old school way that we're used to already, which is I'm just going to go through this stuff backwards. How am I going to go backwards? First of all, a for of is not going to allow me to go backward. It only goes forward from the beginning. So here's an example of where we will use the more powerful for let I equals 0, except we're not going to start at 0, we're going to start at the end, because we want to go backwards. Is that right? I is continue while I is greater than or equal to 0, because we want to go all the way to 0, backwards, and we're going to go backwards, right? And for now, I'm still working incrementally, just half-baked. So I'm just going to console log I to make sure I'm on the right path. It's not the full solution yet. And of course, we have to call this function. Looking good? Let's go ahead and call it. And what I expect to see is what? Words is defined. Oh, that would be an error if it wasn't. Yep. 210 is the correct answer. And that is the correct answer. So I, we know the value is not the words themselves. It's just the index. And so we're going to create another, just to be verbose here, we're going to say the item is items at I. Right? And then let's just say for now we're going to do the print each backwards, not for each. What would this function do? It would be responsible for both things, looping and printing. And so it would do console log item. Whoops, sorry. Does that make sense? Going backwards and printing something, not really anything too genius. And yeah, we're console logging the item now, not just I. Should work. World Lighthouse hello. That seems to work. We don't need this console log anymore. Is there any questions so far before we turn this into a more generic function, because it's not there yet. It's just a simple function. It does a very specific thing. Actually, it does two things. It has the same problem as before. We're going to make it generic, right? So any questions before we do that?
Probably something really silly, simple, but I just want to ask it anyway, just to clarify. But when you go const item equals items I, so what's exactly happening there with items I? Like that's something I need.
Yep. So that's just a comfort level with arrays, and it's okay that you don't have that fully yet. Right. It takes time, right? We introduce it early on because it takes time to build. You have to use them enough to feel comfortable with them. So the questions about this line here, items at I. What this is doing is similar to object lookup notation. With objects, you can also do this. Here, we are saying, hey, items, you're a collection of things, and the way I reference things is by numbers, 0, 1, 2, 3. I, we know, is a number. It's 0, 1, 2, 3, or 0, 1, 2. And so we pass in a 0, and we get the first item. We pass in a 1, we get the second item. And so what we want is the items, which is the actual values inside of each of those blocks in the array. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so item will just equal whichever one you
Yeah, so here I is 0,
Right.
and then items at I really means items at 0, which really means hello.
list all the different ones.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes more sense.
Yep, no problem. Any other questions? So this is doing two things, print each backward. So you might be like, okay, well, I'm going to take that out and put it into a separate function, because that was your suggestion, right? I think it was the path in the right path, which is print each is going to be a function, or print item rather, print word even, is going to be a function that takes in a word, and we're going to console log that word, right? And now we can just call print word, and we have the exact same behavior. All I did was take that line and move it into a separate function, and now I'm calling that item, calling that function, passing in the item, and letting it be called, and the console log be dealt with in this above this function here. Now, this function is not a callback because it's not being passed in. It's just being referenced. This has the same problem where I have to keep these functions together because the second function knows the name of the first function. It expects there to be another function called print word. The way we get around that is by doing something similar to for each, because for each doesn't know any other functions. It doesn't assume that there is a function that has a name. It's just you pass in the function that does the thing, right? We're going to do the same thing here. So this works, but it's not good enough. It's not generic. We want to make it for each backward, right? Like that. And to be like that, it needs to be generic and take in the function as a second parameter. What should we call that function? Sometimes you'll come across code that just says callback. And that's just as bad as arrays, but we still tend to do it. So it's not like the community is not guilty of bad habits. Okay? I would argue, for your sake, just to build the good habit, you might want to give it a more verbose name or more descriptive name. Any suggestions? Reverse this. But that implies that the thing itself is going to get reversed. This is per item. And the item is not being reversed. Like, I'm not taking the hello and reversing that word. You see what I'm saying? So be careful about that. The whole function is a reversal function, but not the individual thing. Actions, yeah, but it sounds too much like callback, right? Maybe something like perform for each. I'm just making, I don't actually know what's the right, it's a pretty vague, it's a hard thing to name. But maybe I'm going to stick with perform for each or perform with each. Because for each sounds like a lot of that too much like that function for each, right? So maybe it's like perform with each or perform on each. How's that? That seems like to read like good documentation. There's a function called for each backward which takes in the items, and it takes in, okay, it's not called a function, so I don't necessarily guarantee, like it doesn't guarantee that this is taking in a function, but the word perform kind of implies that there's a verb here, like a behavior, which implies that it's a function. Okay? So perform on each, and then here, I'm just gonna, I don't need to refer to print word now, I'm just gonna call perform on each, pass in the item, and now, from the outside, if I didn't do this, I'm gonna get an error. What's gonna be the error? The second argument will not be found, and it will just say you're trying to call this thing which is undefined. So I expect to see an error here that perform on each is undefined or is not defined or is not a function, right? And so what we need to do is pass in that function. How do I pass in a function to a function? I refer to it, right? I give it the name of the function, print word. Right, let's make sure that that works. Boom, that works. And now what I've done is I've created a generic function that is not responsible or doesn't care if it's a print, a save, a throwaway, a shred, doesn't care. Right? Could be turned into leet speak. It doesn't care. For each word, just tell me what to do, and you pass in the thing. Now, a couple of things before I get into Kevin's question, if that's okay, if you don't mind, because we're already over time. You'll come across code that doesn't define print word as a named function. you'll come across code and may even want to write code that just takes that function, if it's only used once, and literally copy paste it in place here. Okay, I'm just going to comment it out up here and say that we are not referring to the function by a name. We are just defining it and passing it in all at the same time. Because, hey, it's only done once. I don't need to define it earlier on. If I was using save word 3 different times, I want to maybe save it somewhere and then use it 3 different times. But if I'm only using it once, right, why save it into a variable? Last but not least, and this is the least important part of the lecture, so I don't care if you're not listening. You could turn this into a arrow function. Arrow functions just basically is more than just a different syntax, but for now we can just say it's a different syntax for callback functions, where we can just use an arrow, like looks like an arrow, and it looks slightly different. And some could argue reads better, some could argue reads worse. There is different behavior to arrow functions, and those are defined in the curriculum, but I'm not going to go into them in lecture right now. Okay. It works just the same in this case, though. So I'm going to keep both examples in my notes that I'm going to send out to you. Right. And both will work just fine if I uncomment that out. And the last thing I'll do before I adjourn, and Kevin, I'll get to your question. Sorry for not doing that yet. Is I'll actually take the code that we wrote here and run it through that tutor that we learned about. And maybe I'll just do the one approach, not both. So we'll just use the print word approach here and see what this looks like and visualize it. And feel free to do these kind of things with exercises and things, especially in week 1 that you're not comfortable with the control flow. You're not sure exactly how it's working. So what I expect to see is, okay, words are defined now. So there's an array of words in the top level frame or scope. Then it goes to print word, but it's like, cool, there's a function. Great, I'll come back to it when it's called, right? Does that make sense so far? Now, for each backward, same thing. It's a function that's defined. Great, it's not going to call it. Move on. There's 2 functions now. Print word and for each backward. What's going to be next? Once for each backward is called, right, we're going to pass in 2 things into it. So while we have another frame, we have another scope. And in that scope, we see that there is items, which is passed in, as well as perform on each. And items points to the array, and perform on each points to the print word function. Okay, we're on line 9 right now. So let's hit next. Now we're going to have I starting at 2, right? And cool. So that's going to use I, and it's going to have a item. Why is it? Yeah, this is kind of doing something weird. But essentially, it has an item called word. Yeah? Now it's going to call perform on each. What is perform on each? It's the print word function that was passed into it. So it goes into line 5, which is the inside of print word, which will then console log that. What's the next line it will run after line 5? Yes, it will go back to the second iteration of the loop, and so 10 is the correct answer. We're going to be back to line, well, technically line 9, where it needs to do the decrement again of I, and then it will be at line 10 thereafter. So now I is 1, and item, I'm not sure why it doesn't say item here, that's really confusing. Item is now Lighthouse. And then so on and so forth. So this function for each backward is now calling print word without having to know of its existence because it's passed into it. Callbacks. Not that complicated, but I wanted to kind of make sure I explain things through problems first and then to solutions. Right? Why does this thing exist is a good question. And hopefully you have a slightly better understanding of that. It may still take some time to be able to explain that to someone else because it was just introduced to you, but hopefully this, along with the lab, you'll be able to practice callbacks a little bit more. Before we fully adjourn, I know it's 12:06, I apologize. We'll just quickly complete the notes here. And actually, another thing I'll say here is functions that take in functions are called higher order functions. I didn't want to start with the name, but when you come across the word higher order functions, all that means is this function operates on functions. In fact, this is technically inaccurate. Functions that operate on functions. So that means taking in other functions, or what we haven't done yet, which is returning functions. So if a function returns a function, that is still a higher order function because it's operating on a function. It deals with functions, either takes them in or spits them out, right? This is a math term. This is not a computing term. So you can actually, like, if you Google higher order functions, they're functions because math has functions as well. That's where that term comes from. This is why I introduced this last. I don't care if you remember what higher order functions are. It's more about learning how to use this stuff and doing good software engineering, right? You're not going to get a test question, pass or fail, what's a higher order function? Not that important. But as you get to use them, you'll probably come across that word quite a bit, and you'll probably remember what it means. Okay, so what are the things that we've learned in this lecture? Lots of different things, right? That's one of them. What are other things? Functions are first-class citizens in JavaScript, not in all languages. What does that mean? They can be treated like data or values and passed around to variables, to other functions. This allows us to create more powerful generic functions like for each. Or JavaScript has something like filter, which is also an array. So you can do .for each, you can do .filter. Filter is a generic function. It takes in a function, says, how do you want to filter these resumes? Right? I have an array of resumes. I would like only resumes that have more than 2 years of JavaScript experience. So I'm going to pass in that criteria as a function to the filter function. In this case, they're using arrow function notation and only selecting words that have a length greater than 6. Or in my case, array with a resume with 2 years of experience or more. And that's giving it more insight so it can do its job because it's a very generic function that can't do its job unless it knows what it's actually doing with each thing, right? So filter is another one. There's many others. And you'll, throughout the course of bootcamp, through your projects and whatnot, come across many different higher order functions like filter and for each and so on. Detect map. Yeah, those are the main ones, but there's many others. Okay. You're probably going, what are these words? You'll look them up. This is my hope, right? I'm giving you some research, but really assignments will introduce them as well. Anything else that we learned during this lecture? And I like how shit just came out wrong there too, right? What was the other thing? Sorry. EDD approach, right? Incremental development is great, and EDD is like TDD, which we haven't covered yet. Without worrying about writing tests. But it's the same principle. Work incrementally, small steps, cause an error, fix the error. Right? Anything else?
The importance of properly naming functions.
Oh yeah, good one. So this is approach. And the other one's also approach. Importance of properly naming things. And also importance and tactics for reading code. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you so much for putting up with me for so long. And good luck with the rest of your day. And oh, by the way, yesterday's stuff. If some of you are not done yesterday's stuff, I have a pro tip for you. And this applies only to yesterday, not like generally, okay? So this is maybe a bonus for sticking with me until now. Or maybe tuning in and you were zoned out. That's okay too. Yesterday's stuff, if you did not get to these two, and it looks like there's still some people that haven't, that's okay. Normally, like let's say you're not done music library, finish music library. But these two, even though they're not stretch, you can leave them for later. They will not affect you in terms of today's work or tomorrow's work. So you can come back to them on the weekend. They're still core, you need to get them done. EMs will not be happy if you're not done them. But don't let them block you from working on today's things. Okay? Obviously stretch, same deal. Cool? So it's just the last two, which is all about this. I know it was covered in lecture and all of that. It's very important. You will get to it. But don't let it block you for today. Okay? All right. Have fun. Cheers. Sorry I couldn't get to it.
It's just